Today we'll be covering Chapter 17, Nutrition. So let's begin by defining what is a nutrient. A nutrient is a chemical taken into the body, providing energy and building blocks for new molecules. All right, so we've talked a little bit about some nutrients, some molecules, important molecules for our body, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, right? So this would also include like vitamins and minerals. So what we're going to do here is not really focus on those nutrients, the different types of nutrients and what they do, their characteristics and things like that. Instead, we're going to focus on what happens to those nutrients. Why do we need those nutrients? And where do they go in our body? What happens to them? So to do that, we have to define a few terms, and such as metabolism. Okay. Metabolism is the sum total of all the chemical reactions that occur in the body. And we have lots of chemical reactions. Some chemical reactions build molecules from smaller ones, and other reactions break down molecules from larger ones. All right, so catabolism or catabolic reactions take larger molecules and break them into smaller ones. And as we, sever those bonds between, within those molecules, we release energy. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about energy in just a moment. The other type of reaction in general is anabolic reaction or anabolism. These take small molecules and then put them together to form larger ones. These require energy. All right, so let's go ahead and I'll show you an example. So, a simple example would be, let's start with a catabolic or catabolism, right? Where we take a larger molecule, such as a disaccharide. All right, so an example would be like sucrose. Sucrose is, sugar, table sugar. Okay, so if we take a disaccharide and we break it down, we can break it down into its two components, two monosaccharides plus another monosaccharide. Right? So this would be a glucose and a fructose. Oops. All right, these are two monosaccharides. And so we took our larger molecule and we broke it down into two smaller molecules. This type of reaction is called, an example is hydrolysis. Okay, so let's look at this term. Hydro refers to water. Lysis, or to lyse, is to break apart. So this type of reaction, it's a specific type of reaction, requires water. So if we add water to this reaction, okay, we take water and it splits apart the disaccharide into its components, right? So we add water and it breaks apart the molecule. Okay. What would be an anabolic reaction or anabolism? Maintain the same term here. All right, it's kind of the opposite. So this can go the other way where we can take monosaccharides plus another monosaccharide. We take small molecules and then we can build a disaccharide, a larger one. Okay, so here we have our glucose, we have our fructose, and then we can form sucrose, table sugar. Okay, now this is an example of a dehydration synthesis reaction. So this is a hydrolysis reaction, and this is a dehydration synthesis reaction. RXN means reaction. All right. And so let's look at this term, dehydration. Okay, dehydration, synthesis. So we build a bigger molecule by removing water. Okay, now these are just examples of a catabolic and an anabolic reaction. So I think of like anabolic steroids, right? Maybe you've heard of that term. Well, steroids build molecules. Anabolic steroids build molecules, specifically muscle cells, right? Or build muscle cells. So and what it does is it takes, amino acids now and puts them together to form proteins within muscles, and that causes them to enlarge because you're making more proteins inside there, right? So that's an example of an anabolic reaction. Actually very similar here, but using amino acids, right? So just to get the general gist of what these terms mean. All right, let's go back. All right, and then that leads into some processes. Let's take a look at, what does this mean in our bodies? Okay, in our cells. So we'll start with energy molecule. What is the main energy molecule used in the body? And some of you may know this. This is called ATP. Grab this. Oops. All right, sometimes I'm not very good at grabbing these things. Okay, so ATP is the main energy molecule, adenosine triphosphate. This tells you that it has 3 phosphates attached to it. In fact, let's take a quick look at how it's used, kind of. Let me see where that is. Let me find that little picture here. All right, so let me put this molecule here. So it's an adenine with 3 phosphates, adenosine triphosphate. All right, so how it works is we take ATP, this energy molecule, and we break off phosphates. And every time we break off a phosphate, we get energy released to be able to power cellular processes. Okay, so we take that energy to drive anabolism. Okay, we take the energy to make bigger molecules. And then, so here we have the ADP now, adenosine diphosphate with a separate phosphate. And we can add phosphates back to the ADP, all right, which kind of restores the ATP. Now, this requires energy. So as we undergo catabolic reactions, okay, we break down bigger molecules into smaller ones, it's going to release energy that's going to help us to be able to restore that ATP. Okay, so this I just really wanted to show you the ATP. Don't worry really about how anabolism and catabolism, are powered by this, but to see ATP. Okay, and how we derive energy from it for our cells. All our cells run on ATP. And ATP is really key because when we run out of ATP, we die. Okay, we stop living. So it's actually very important. So now the rest of this question is asking about how do we make this ATP, all right? This is called cellular respiration. Okay, I'm going to put a few things and I'm going to go through the process and then I'll draw a few things here. All right, so let's take a look at what is this process and how does it work in our bodies. So, all right, so cellular respiration is a process that transfers energy from the food we eat into usable cellular energy, that ATP. All right, really, it's what happens to our food. Okay, why do we eat food? What is the purpose? We eat it, it gets broken down in our digestive system, we absorb nutrients across the wall into the blood. Those nutrients are taken to all parts of the body where the cells, to every cell that's going to use those nutrients then to make ATP. All right, that's what happens. Now, cellular respiration, remember we talked about respiration, the respiratory system. Respiration is that process of exchanging gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. So we're going to see that process, but instead of just like at our lungs, we're going to see it as it occurs at the cells. Okay, so it's respiration. We're exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide, but it occurs at the cells, right? All right. And then part of this question is, why do we need oxygen? Okay, what happens when we don't get oxygen? Now, most people know you don't get oxygen, you die. But on a cellular level, right, and on a metabolic, microscopic level, why? Where does it fit into this process? And where does carbon dioxide fit into this process? Where does food fit into this process, etc.? Okay, so cellular respiration occurs in three stages, three steps. The first one is called glycolysis. Now I want you to, again, don't memorize things if you don't have to. Let's look at terms that we've already talked about. Gluco, that's like glucose, right? Sugar, glucose, and we already mentioned lysis, that refers to breaking apart. So glycolysis is the process of taking a glucose and splitting it apart. Okay. Citric acid cycle. This is a cycle that goes around and around that feeds back into itself to form a cyclical set of reactions. Okay. And the last one's called an electron transport chain. Okay, it's a chain of molecules that transports electrons along it. All right, so those are the three parts to cellular respiration, and they occur in different parts of the cell. A lot of it is occurring in the mitochondrion. And I'm going to draw that now. Okay, and then before I draw that and leave this page, the reaction, kind of the overall reaction for cellular respiration, I didn't balance my equations like, the proper amount of carbons and hydrogens and oxygens. So I just want you to get the gist of it. The details are not as important, okay? I want you to kind of understand the basics of it. So we take food, we eat, we breathe. Okay, those are things that most people know that are important to life. We breathe oxygen, we eat food. Okay, when we don't get either one of those, we die, right? And then those feed into reactions and some of the byproducts. Okay, what do we get out of these reactions? We get carbon dioxide, that's actually a waste product. We get water made, and we get a lot of ATPs. Okay, and the ATP is what we use to run, okay, to live, really. All right, so now let's go ahead and we're going to draw a few things, such as where does this occur? So I'm going to draw a mitochondria. Now, if you recall in our cell lecture, the mitochondrion This is singular. Okay, plural is mitochondria. Okay, so I'm going to draw a mitochondrion. Remember what we called it? We called it the powerhouse of the cell. Okay, why? Because this is where we make the majority of our ATP. Okay, if you look at cells, the more mitochondria it has, the more ATP that that cell is going to produce. Okay? And vice versa, less mitochondria means less energy you get out of that cell. All right, so I'm going to draw a mitochondrion. I'm going to draw a little guy here, and then I'm going to draw actually a big one because we're going to show all this happening. And I'm going to label it. Where's my pen here? So this is a mitochondrion. It's double, has two membranes, double membrane. This is called the outer membrane. And this is the inner membrane. And inside is called the matrix of the mitochondrion. Okay. Now there's some of these processes we talked about is going to occur in different areas of this mitochondrion. So let's go ahead and now I'm going to draw a big, kind of a big cell with a giant mitochondrion, not to scale, okay? But we're going to show where all these processes occur. So let's go ahead. I'm going to turn my paper over and maybe give yourself a little bit of space here. Okay. So I'm going to draw a giant cell. Like this. Okay, so this is our cell. And then I'm going to draw a big mitochondrion. I'll do it here. Right? We have the outer membrane, we have the inner membrane, and we have the matrix. Okay, so here's our mitochondrion. Right? This is the cytoplasm of the cell. Okay, and we have other organelles out here. We have a nucleus and all the other things that are involved in a cell. All right, so we from our blood, okay, remember we've eaten food, it's broken down in our digestive system into small nutrients, and we get some glucose. Make it a different color. So we get glucose. What happens to that glucose? So glucose will enter the cell, okay, from our blood. And remember, we talked about when we talked about the endocrine system, the role of insulin in allowing glucose to enter the cell, right? Okay, very important. So once in the cell cytoplasm, that glucose is going to undergo some reactions. It's going to go through the steps of glycolysis. So glycolysis, how do we break apart a glucose molecule? Okay, it requires several steps. It's not a single step. All right. And in the end, we're going to get two molecules of pyruvate. Okay, it's just another molecule. Okay, I'm not so concerned about knowing this, but no, glycolysis means breaking apart a glucose molecule. So glucose has 6 carbons in it. It's got hydrogens and oxygens in it also, but it's got 6 carbons. And so what we end up with are 2 molecules that are 3 carbons each. Okay, it kind of splits it apart. And a pyruvate is three carbons in it. All right. So this process is called glycolysis. All right, and it occurs in the cell cytoplasm. So we haven't even gotten into the mitochondrium. Then what happens? That pyruvate is going to undergo some changes, some reactions to form a molecule called acetyl coenzyme A, acetyl-CoA. It's just a molecule. Oh, I should have drew my mitochondria much bigger. All right, anyway, this acetyl-CoA will undergo a series of many steps called the citric acid cycle. The citric acid cycle, closer here, all right, is a series of many steps, each step requiring a different enzyme to make it go. And where that acetyl-CoA is converted into a different molecule, into a different molecule, into a different molecule, and the end product feeds back in to keep this little cycle going. Now, there's some things that we get out of the citric acid cycle. The first thing we get out of these reactions is we get some carbon dioxide, which acts as a byproduct, a waste product that diffuses out and goes back into the blood. Okay, so this is blood here. All right, so we're going to diffuse the carbon dioxide. It's going to, and that's part of, right, respiration. It's that exchange of gases. And we'll talk about the oxygen in just a second. All right, diffuses out and it goes to our lungs and we exhale it. Okay. Another thing we get out of this is we get a little bit of ATP. Ooh, and I should mention, I didn't put it here, but out of glycolysis, we do get some ATP, a little bit. Not much at all, but a little bit. Okay, so glycolysis gets us some ATP. We get also out of here some electrons. Now, electrons, maybe I'll make them a different color. Electrons are carried by specific molecules. One of them being a nicotine based molecule. Okay, that carries the electrons. Okay, so there's electrons in this molecule, right? And it's this molecule that acts as what we call a carrier molecule to carry the electrons around. And we'll see where they go in just a moment. We also get some electrons out of here. And again, carried as NADH. Also another molecule called FADH2. Okay, so both of these carry the electrons around. All right, I'm just going to put electrons, but know that they're carried on molecules. And what these molecules do is they transport the electron to a series of proteins that are embedded in the inner membrane of the mitochondrium. And so these electrons are carried along these. Okay. And then I'll make this a little bigger so it's a little easier to see. But right now, just kind of pay attention here. So what happens to these electrons? Oxygen, which is carried around in the blood, will go into the cells and it's going to pick up the electrons at the end and make water. So oxygen plus electrons plus hydrogen ions form water. And so the oxygen acts as an electron acceptor, they call it. They pick up the electrons, add some hydrogen, a couple of hydrogens, and we get water from it. Okay. And it's from this process that we get a lot of ATP. I think it's like 28 ATPs out of this process, where these are like two ATPs. Okay, so maybe let me make that a little bigger. Okay, so I'm going to draw my mitochondrion really big here. Okay, here's the inner membrane. Sorry, I made it so small before. All right, we get the acetyl-CoA coming in. It's going to feed into the citric acid cycle. We're going to get some carbon dioxide out of it. We'll get a little ATP out of it. And then we'll get some electrons out of it, carried as a NADH and FADH2. And I'm not going to ask you this, right? It's more about the electrons I want to know because it's going to go to the electron transport chain, the electron transport chain. All right. The electron is going to be carried along here. And then we get oxygen that enters. Okay. And the oxygen is going to pick up those electrons to form water. Okay. So as the electrons are transported along here, they're picked up by the oxygen, add some hydrogens, and we get water. And through this process, we get a lot of ATP made. And this is what's going to drive most of our cellular processes. Okay. All right. So now, if I ask the question, why do we need oxygen? Okay, if you go under the water and you cannot come up and you cannot get oxygen, right? Someone cuts off your supply of oxygen. Why? What happens? Why do we die? Without oxygen, there's nothing to pick up the electrons. And all of this backs up and we don't make ATP. Okay, so that's why oxygen is important. Okay. Where does carbon dioxide fit in? Oh, it's a waste product from the process of cellular respiration. Okay. So now let's go back. Okay, and I'm going to put a little picture here, which you may like more. Okay. All right, so here's glycolysis in the cytosol, which is the cytoplasm. Here we get pyruvate forming acetyl-CoA, which feeds into the citric acid cycle. We get some electrons carried by NADH, some electrons carried by FADH2. Those transport the electrons to this inner membrane, and we get oxygen that picks up those electrons and forms water. And we get 28 ATPs for every molecule, actually for every pyruvate, I believe. All right, so then we have some ATPs formed here and then some ATPs formed here. Okay, actually that's pretty good. Now part of that question, we didn't actually answer all that. Where's the rest of the question? Describe the steps involved in the production of ATP when oxygen is not present and when oxygen is present. So what we defined here, what we set up here is when oxygen is present, right? So here's oxygen. When you have plenty of oxygen. But there are times when you might not have enough oxygen to produce the energy that you need. So, if you're sprinting, okay, so you're running a sprint and you get tired. There's a point where you cannot go any longer. right? You can only sprint for so long. Why? What is happening? You're not getting enough oxygen to be able to undergo cellular respiration. So, what is that other process called when you run out of oxygen or you don't get enough oxygen to supply, to make enough ATP to keep going? The second process is called anaerobic metabolism. So, we just looked at what's called aerobic metabolism. Aerobic means with oxygen. Anaerobic is without oxygen. So that's this process. So let's look at what happens. So when you don't get enough oxygen, okay, you still, you ate food, you have glucose, still makes pyruvate, but without oxygen, the pyruvate undergoes a different set of reactions. Okay. And in fact, we do get 2 ATPs out of it. We make a little bit of ATP, but certainly not enough to continue sprinting. But we form something called lactic acid or lactate. Okay, so pyruvate undergoes a different set of reactions that forms lactic acid instead, and that builds up in our muscles. And it is a contributing factor to fatigue. Fatigue is complicated, and there's more to it than just a buildup of lactic acid. All right, there's other things that are happening within the muscles. So, but this is one reason um, why we do have to stop. Okay, number one, we're not getting enough ATP. So if we go back to our picture here, what does this look like here? Okay, so with enough oxygen, it's going to enter the mitochondria and do that. So I'm going to say, plus O2, we go there. Without O2, I'm going to go minus O2, we form lactic acid, lactate. And we do get, again, a little bit of ATP. I'll put 2 here in that process. Some people call this fermentation. Okay, so if we are a different molecule, a different organism, let's say we're yeast. Okay, if we're yeast and we get stuck in a condition, a place where there's no oxygen, right? Like you take yeast and you give it sugar, you give it a food source, but you prevent air, oxygen from reaching it. It's going to undergo anaerobic fermentation. It's going to go anaerobic pathways. And instead of lactic acid, it will make alcohol. Okay. And then that alcohol builds up into into the solution that it's sitting in. And eventually the alcohol content will kill the yeast, kill the organism. And that's why certain alcohols can only get to a certain percentage of alcohol because the organism actually dies, okay, swimming in its own alcohol. All right, so again, there's just different pathways that can be, that an organism can utilize to get ATP. All right, now maybe I'm gonna go back and look at one more thing. Like we're kind of done with the questions. So I want to point out that you understand where these are occurring, because that could be a question. You have to know what the process is and where does it occur. So the cytoplasm is glycolysis, citric acid cycle is in the matrix of the mitochondria, and the electron transport chain is in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. Okay, I hope that's really clear. I want to just put one more thing that it's very interesting. I think it is. Okay, I can find it here. All right, so now knowing that, let's take a look at kind of put this in terms of food, what we eat. Okay. So carbohydrates are our main form of fuel in the body. Okay, when we eat carbs, it forms glucose. We can break it down into glucose, and then it goes through cellular respiration to get ATP, right? Okay, but what are protein and lipids? How does that feed in? It's not a carbohydrate. These nutrients can feed into different parts of the pathway. So proteins can feed in, here in the production of acetyl-CoA. Lipids fit in different places within these pathways, these reactions. And so understanding how they fit and how they fit into the production of ATP, because that's the goal, is to make ATP, right? And so this is where these fit in. And so, I mean, let's think about something, like a common or a diet that's really popular now, or a way of eating that's very popular, which is like low carbohydrates. So, what happens when you decrease your carbohydrates? Okay. Um, this all deals with metabolism, right? So when you decrease your carbohydrates and let's say increase your proteins, what does that do? Well, we switch to different pathways, but there are byproducts from using those other pathways, either protein or lipids, right? So, for example, let's take a look here. Well, in both of these pathways, lipids, proteins, there are ketones that are produced. Okay. So as you decrease your carbs, your body has to find other sources to use as energy. And so that's kind of the whole idea of like the ketogenic diet, is you use these other sources. So for example, you begin utilizing your fat stores. That's why, fat disappears. So as you decrease your carbs, you turn to other sources like lipids, fats. And so as you utilize the fat stores in your body, you produce something called ketones. Now, ketones can be bad if you have too many. So diabetics, so people who have diabetes mellitus, they are unable to utilize their carbohydrates, right? And so they start using their fat supplies, and they make a lot of ketones, and that can be harmful. But they find that a little bit of ketones may be beneficial for your nervous system, and they found out that maybe your nervous system can utilize ketones instead of carbohydrates. Right? That's ongoing studies right now in ketones and their role in like the nervous system. It was once thought that the brain runs completely on glucose. Your nervous system utilizes glucose. And for the most part, that's true. Your brain runs on glucose. You know that because when you don't get your blood sugar drops, okay, then you can get lightheaded and things like that. So yes, but they're finding that ketones, certain parts of the nervous system can also utilize ketones. So I would suggest uh, checking that out, right? Instead of just doing diets and trying these things, it's all about metabolism and these pathways and how to utilize them to get the desired result that you want. But I think it's important that you do some homework, you do some study before you undergo any type of changes in your diet, to understand these pathways. And again, to consider taking a nutrition class and to see how that works. All right. Thanks for watching, and I will see you at the next lecture.